Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the latest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, we're going to be continuing once again our series of Ultra Budget Beginner decks. That's right everybody, save those mythics and rare wildcards because you won't be needing them for this deck.
You had my curiosity, but now you have my attention.
We're going to be once again continuing the series as we now dive into a mono blue deck for those of you out there who like to play a little bit more on the reactive side with a deck that we're calling basically Tempo. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content so you don't miss out on any of the gameplay, booster pack openings, deck decks, and so much more. Whether you are a new person to the channel or you're a person that likes to just enjoy budget decks, here's basically the stats for you before we get into it. So, we're of course playing a mono blue deck with a 2.1 average mana curve. You're looking at right now about 20 creatures in the deck. We have 16 instants, 4 enchantments, and 20 lands. Just like our other videos, this deck tech will assume that you understand the basics of the game and you're just trying to again find something that is really easy to get into and build up on so you can make it even better in the future, or of course save your rare and mythic wildcards for something also that maybe you want to build up towards. So with that, let's talk about the creatures in the deck and show you how we're going to support them. So in the 1-drop slot, you're going to work with Delver of Secrets. You have Siren Storm Tainer, Spectral Sailor. In the 2-drop slot, we will have Brineborn Cutthroat, and way out in the 7-drop, I know that sounds a little awkward to say that, but you're going to see how it works, is Tolarian Terror. First off, of course, Delver of Secrets. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can look at the top card of your library, you can reveal the card. If it's an instant or sorcery, you can transform it into Insectile Aberration, which is just a generic flying creature. Very powerful, of course, in the early game. If you can flip it, it becomes a really dangerous threat that can easily close out the game quickly against your opponent. With that, your other 1-drop that I mentioned was Siren Storm Tamer. This is more of a support piece, but it can also do some decent damage in the early game. However, you want to ideally save this as it can sacrifice itself to counter a target spell or ability that targets you or a creature you control. This will help you, of course, protect something like your Delver of Secrets, your Brineborn Cutthroat, or the Tolarian Terror. And then your other utility creature is going to be Spectral Sailor. It has flash, so that means you can bring it in anytime you can cast an instant. It has flying, and then for 4 mana, you get to draw a card. Also really awesome, very underrated in most decks. A lot of people don't realize that although it's a little pricey to draw 1 card off of 4 mana, this is going to help you, of course, make sure that you can maintain momentum against your opponent. That 2-drop slot, as I just mentioned, was Brineborn Cutthroat. This also has flash, so you can bring it in anytime you can cast an instant, but it also has, whenever you cast a spell during an opponent's turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Brineborn Cutthroat. Very powerful and can be sometimes a game-winning piece against our opponent. But how do we do that? We'll explain that in just a moment. We'll finish off with our last card, which is going to be Tolarian Terror. This 7-mana serpent creature says this spell costs 1 less to cast for each instant or sorcery card in your graveyard, and it has a protection in the form of Ward 2. Ward 2, for those of you who are a little bit newer to the game or haven't been playing in a while, whenever a permanent with Ward becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you counter it unless that player pays the Ward cost. So, has its own decent little built-in protection, and this is also going to be one of your late game threats. This will get super cheaper as the game gets on, and of course you should be able to cast a bunch of these for dirt cheap. But with that, as I just mentioned earlier, how are we going to get there with this game plan?
Good question.
Basically how this deck works is we'll then utilize cards such as Spell Pierce, which is a counter spell, which allows you to counter target non-creature spell here unless its controller pays 2. You can then utilize other cards such as Lofty Denial. Lofty Denial will also counter a target spell unless its controller pays 1, unless of course we have flying. If we have a flying creature, then they have to pay 4. And our other major counter spell is going to be Lookout's Dispersal. This will cost 1 less if we control a pirate, and same thing, just like Lofty Denial, they have to basically pay the 4, otherwise their spell will get countered. So you have 12 counter spells in the deck to protect your game plan. As far as our tempo play here, we also have You Come to a River. It's a 2-mana instant that allows us to either choose between either returning a target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, or you can use Find a Crossing to give target creature +1/+0 until end of turn, and it cannot be blocked. Very powerful also, and can be a great way to just force through the last points of damage. You can stick the Sail-like on your Tolarian Terror, or maybe your Brineborn Cutthroat, give them an extra little pump, and then hopefully you can finish off your opponent and get that victory. Since we are playing, again, in best of 1 and also as simple as possible, your islands are all you need, just 20 straight out. Yes, as I mentioned with previous other videos, there are potential cards you can add in if you do want to upgrade the budget a little bit, but again, we'll worry about that a little bit later on. As I just mentioned at the very beginning of the deck tech, you're going to try to rock your Delver of Secrets. You're going to hopefully flip that with either revealing one of your counter spells. This honestly can also play a little bit into playing some mind games with your opponent, because they may be aware that you will have a counter spell in hand, but they know that sooner sooner or later, they're going to have to find a way to either get around it. But by that point, you should hopefully be able to have a couple of extra counterspells or protection in hand to ensure that you can get to your victory. Eventually, you're just going to start poking away at your opponent's life little by little, and then hopefully just drive them nuts. And sometimes you do get opponents that will just kind of quit immediately on you. But otherwise, just be aware that the deck will work ideally if you can keep drawing into cards. So if you do have that Curious Obsession on the early game, if you have your Siren Storm Tamer, don't be afraid again to sacrifice those if you have to, just to make sure that you can save the momentum and tempo plays that you're going to need later on. With that, as the game progresses, you will probably eventually get a Tolarian Terror if it does go a little bit longer than anticipated, but by that point, if you've already wasted a couple of counter spells, a couple of tempo plays, you should be able to then bring down that Tolarian Terror sometimes for 3, 2, even 1 mana, and that'll be a big enough threat that your opponent most likely will be out of action at that point, and you'll have no problem getting that win. Save your You Come to a Rivers for when you absolutely need them to either force through the last remaining points of damage using Tolarian Terror, or if you really have to, say, protect yourself against a Wrath, you can bounce away something like your Delver of Secrets back to your hand, or if it's something that you just can't deal with that your opponent has, such as an artifact, enchantment, or a planeswalker, you can also use that copy of You Come to a River to bounce those threats away to make sure that it will not disrupt our game plan. Ideally, the way the deck wants to run is you want to keep some of your mana open at the end of your turn, so this way you can maintain a counterspell, but you have to be careful as to what you are counterspelling. Sometimes you might be in situations where you're going to have to counterspell aggressively just to force your opponent to tap out. That might mean that you're going to have to sacrifice one of your other spells just to ensure that you can force your opponent into a bad matchup, but this sometimes can be the better option versus just allowing them to just handle whatever's on the board. On the other side, you might have to just allow something to resolve, but then protect using that counterspell against something that's bigger that you may anticipate your opponent is going to have. Of course, just like the other deck types that I mentioned earlier, we need to also address and be clear about the weaknesses to this tempo deck. So one of the biggest weaknesses, of course, is aside from counterspells and the bounce effect from You Come to a River, you don't really have any removal against your opponent's stuff. So in other words, if your opponent has a ton of creature removal, you can counterspell that as much as possible, but eventually they may be able to just get underneath some of your counterspells abilities. But otherwise, my only other thing I just want to add on there is, if you do like this style of gameplay, as you can see on screen right now, I'm going to put up a couple of the thumbnails that I've done from other styles of these tempo gameplays out there that I've done, some other deck techs out there. You're going to see that it mostly hasn't changed actually that much over the past couple of years, because many of the cards have been pretty solid, but there are some going to be tweaks and some other things you could argue are better or worse depending on your meta, so adjust accordingly. If you do feel even a little bit bolder, you can even try to utilize the tempo strategy if you're a fan of that and maybe splash it to another color, or if you're a person that likes to maintain this style of gameplay, by all means, there are definitely going to be some rares and mythics you want to invest in if you do want to play this. But definitely, again, check out some of the extra videos that I've had. Some of them are a little on the older side, but I assure you, many of the strategies are similar to what we have today. I really hope that those of you who are watching are enjoying and appreciating this information that I'm providing for you, whether you are, again, a new player out there, or again, maybe you're a veteran player that's just trying to get yourself started on Arena and you want to save up those mythics and rares for a meta deck. I can definitely say this is going to be one of those awesome decks that out of the other 5 colors, not to say that the other ones are bad, but this one probably will be the most competitive if you actually do want to take it into ranked. But otherwise, my only other final thoughts I want to say on this deck is, actually, personally, this is not my typical way of playing Magic, but I know many of you out there do like this style of gameplay out there. But the good thing about this style is, versus many of the other colors, this is probably going to be one of the cheapest, maybe aside from, I don't know, mono red, where it's going to be the easiest and most affordable way to play the game, and it still actually maintains very good competitiveness even at this ultra budget level. I can assure you right now, if you do actually want to take this into ranked, this might actually help you rank up a little bit if you do want to try to at least get past some of the early levels in Arena ranked. So be sure to give it a try, and I can assure you, if you are a fan of mono blue, if you're a fan of draw go style, if you're a fan of, well, basically being annoying versus your opponent with counter spells and types of plays which forces them into making bad choices against your strategy, I assure you, if you do take this deck for a spin, you'll be very satisfied with it, you'll drive your opponent crazy, and you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later!